This part has more terminology than part 1. As before, don't be afraid, they are just labels and underneath is just 12 friendly notes. The term harmony refers to the combining of notes. It underlies chords, chord progressions, as well as melodic harmony. For example, the harmony part a backup singer might create. An interval is just a measurement of distance between notes. We have already learned the names of 3 intervals, the half step, the whole step, and the octave. There are other interval names as well. Here is the familiar major scale. As with the labels used for notes and scales, the following set of labels we use for intervals is also based off the major scale. When 2 notes overlap, we call the interval unison. An interval between the first and the second note is called a second. The interval between the first and the third note is a third, and so on until the octave. Past the octave, we stay with the major scale pattern but extend the numbers. This is a ninth, for example. Since an interval is just a measure of distance between 2 notes, it doesn't matter which note the interval starts on. This is a fourth. You can also think of it as 5 half steps. So this is also a fourth. So is this. So is this. It's not tied to the major scale in any way. It just gets its label from the major scale pattern. As long as the distance is 5 half steps, it's a fourth. When we labeled scale notes, we needed a way to refer to the notes that aren't in the major scale, and we used the terms flat and sharp. We use the term natural to mean neither flat nor sharp. With intervals, we use the terms diminished, augmented, and perfect. This is a fifth, also known as a perfect fifth. This is a diminished fifth, and this is an augmented fifth. In the same way that there is no 3 sharp or 4 flat note, and no 7 sharp or 1 flat note, we don't typically say augmented third or diminished fourth, and we don't say augmented seventh or diminished octave. There is one naming variation you should know. Remember that a scale is called major or minor depending on the presence of a natural 3 or a flat 3. Similarly, a third interval is normally called a major third. A diminished third interval is normally called a minor third. It's just a naming quirk. A chord is just a collection of notes played at the same time. This is a chord. So is this. And this. As with scales, there are many chords, and some are more common than others. In most music, we start with a scale, and more or less stick to that scale for the duration of the song. So if we want to construct some chords that we can use to accompany that scale, we try to use only notes found in that scale. Here's the major scale. Let's play the 1 note, the 3 note, and the 5 note together. This pattern, where we pick a root note for our chord, in this case the 1 note, and then play every other note from the scale for a total of 3 notes, generates the most common chords. Because this chord is rooted at the 1 note, we label it with Roman numeral 1. Roman numerals indicate chords, and Arabic numerals indicate notes. Because this chord has a major third interval off the root, we call it a major chord. The other interval in this chord is a fifth, between the root and the 5 note. Let's construct another chord, this time rooted off the 2 note. Following the same pattern, we find the 2 note, the 4 note, and the 6 note. If you count the half steps, you will see that the first interval off the root note is not a major third. It is a minor third. So this is a minor chord, and we label it with a Roman numeral 2 and a lowercase m to indicate that it is minor. Major chords have no special indication that they are major. The 2 minor chord also has the same fifth interval between the outer notes. The chord based off the 3 note is also a standard minor chord, so we call it the 3 minor. The chord based off the 4 has a major third in it. It is the 4 chord. When we get to the 5 chord, we start getting into the notes in the next octave. That's fine. The 5 chord uses the 5 note, the 7 note, and the 2 note. It is also a major chord. The 6 chord is minor. When we get to the 7 chord, something different happens. We have a minor third as the first interval, but the wider interval is no longer a fifth. It is a diminished fifth. This shape of notes gets a special label. It's called a diminished chord, and is usually notated with the term dim or a small superscript circle. We have now found all the simple 3-note chords based off the notes in the major scale. This is called the harmonization of the major scale. It's easy to remember. The 1, 4, and 5 are major, everything else is minor, but the 7 is diminished. If you've heard a musician say, "This song is easy, it's just a 1, 4, 5, they are referencing these chord labels. We can take any scale and find the harmonization. If we start with this scale, you can see that the 3-note chords it generates are very different. But the terminology used to label chords is based off of the major scale. As in part 1, we are working with relative labels here. We can make them absolute as we did before. Here's the line of absolute pitch names. We imagine a ghost copy of the line above it, and we slide our major scale to the desired location. Let's make our scale based off the C-sharp note. This means the C-sharp is the 1 note, and we can spell the major scale by simply applying the familiar shape. The 1 chord is based off the 1 note, and we know that it is major. As usual, it includes the 1 note, the 3 note, and the 5 note, which at this location are C-sharp, F, and G-sharp. In absolute terms, it is a C-sharp chord, or to be explicit, C-sharp major. Note that when someone says C-sharp, you don't know if they are referring to the note named C-sharp or the major chord based off of the C-sharp note. It just depends on the context and will usually be obvious. The chord based off the 2 note we know from the major scale harmonization to be minor, so here we find it to be a chord named D-sharp minor. The 3 minor chord is F minor. The 4 chord is major and based off the F-sharp, so we have F-sharp major. The rest of the chords continue following the pattern of the harmonization. 1, 4, and 5 are major, the rest are minor, but the 7 is diminished. In practice, most musicians just get used to seeing certain chords grouped together. Here's the major scale rooted at the G note. Musicians may recognize the G, C, D, and E minor chords as frequent companions. These are the 1, 4, 5, and 6 minor from the G major scale. This all may seem complicated, but you have seen how simple the underlying patterns really are. Most musicians don't need to be able to do this stuff in their heads. With just a bit of practice, you can understand it well enough to work it out when you have to. Consider the 5 chord. It uses the 5 note, the 7 note, and the 2 note from the next octave. But these chords we've been constructing don't have to lie in a simple cluster like this. We can take the 2 note from the top and reflect it to the 2 note on the bottom, and the chord still sounds fine. Let's take the 5 note and bounce it down an octave as well. Let's throw another 5 and another 2 on top of the pile. This is still a 5 chord. These different versions are called voicings of the chord, and they have a big impact on the feel of the music. The lowest note in a voicing is especially important. Often a chord has the root note as the lowest note, but not always. If not, it is sometimes explicitly denoted with a slash. For example, the A major chord has the notes A, C sharp, and E. If the voicing uses the E as the lowest note, it will often be written as A/E. Depending on the musical genre, chords may have extra color notes added to them or alterations to the original notes to change the sound. Here is our 1 chord. If we play the 4 note in place of the 3, we call this a sus4 chord. The sus stands for suspended. If we play the normal 1 chord but add a 6, we call it a 1/6 chord. Breaking this labeling pattern, if we add the flat 7 note, we make a 7 chord, also known as the dominant 7 chord. If we add the natural 7 note, we make a major 7 chord. It's inconsistent, yes, you can tell musicians made this system up. If we take a regular minor chord, but flatten the 5th, we get a diminished chord, which we saw before when we harmonized the major scale. If we add a 6th note to the diminished chord, we get what's called, strangely, a diminished 7 chord. If we take a regular major or minor chord and don't play the 3rd at all, it becomes a 5 chord. The majorness or minorness of a 5 chord is ambiguous. There are many other chords with fancy-sounding names. You can just look them up when you want to. This is all just a basic nomenclature to quickly describe which of the 12 notes are being played and to give us a hint about how the chord should be voiced. The numbers used in chord names to describe added color notes are referring to intervals from the root note. Let's say we are describing the 4 chord and we want to add a color note. The standard 4 chord uses the 4 note, the 6 note, and the 1 note. If we want to make the 4 major 7 chord, we need to add a note that is the interval of a 7th above the root note. So we add the 3 note to the chord to make 4 major 7. A major 7 chord looks the same wherever it may be rooted. Another way to think of a major 7 chord is that we are adding a color note that is a half step underneath the root. If we play 1 major 7, we do this by adding the 7. If we play 4 major 7, we do it by adding a 3. If we play 5 major 7, we add the flat 5. In other words, all these chord names like 2 minor and 3 diminished 7 and 6 minor are really just shorthand describing various shapes. Once you know the shape, it's the same wherever it's rooted. A chord progression is just a series of chords. There aren't any firm guidelines about which chord should come after which chord, or when a change of chord should happen, but the interplay of the melody and the chords behind it is fundamental to music. Often chords are chosen because they contain the note currently played in the melody. Sometimes chords are chosen because they don't contain the melody note. It's up to the musician to choose. Consider the Happy Birthday song. Towards the end, the melody briefly lands on a very dissonant note outside of the chord. The top line indicates the current melody note, and the bottom line indicates the current chord being played. At this moment, the chord has changed to the 4 chord, which has the 4, 6, and 1 notes, but the melody goes to a natural 7 note before eventually moving down to the more consonant 6 note. Listen to it again. For that brief moment, the melody disagrees with the chord. Most melodies will disagree with the underlying chords countless times throughout a song. It's up to the composer to decide how often this should happen. Sometimes the disagreeing notes go by so quickly, you hardly notice their relationship to the chord. Other times, as with Happy Birthday, we dwell on that disagreement for its own sake. None of what we've seen here should be thought of as rules. Sometimes notes out of the scale are played. Sometimes chords that are not harmonizations of the scale are used. Sometimes the key changes in the middle of the song. Sometimes notes are bent into the in-between spaces between the 12 notes. Sometimes things happen that no amount of music theory can explain. The bending of these patterns is often what makes music interesting. Knowing these patterns allows you to bend them intentionally. When you approach a new piece of music, you can start by determining the scale in use. Once you have found it, spend some time determining what the harmonization of that scale would be. Try to think of music in relative terms. If someone presents you with a song using a D major scale and the chords D, G, A, and B minor, recognize that this is simply 1, 4, 5, and 6 minor from the harmonization of the major scale. It takes a little practice and a bit of familiarity with common keys and scales, but it's better than memorizing things by rote with no understanding of the patterns underneath. When you pay attention to the patterns, your ear will start to develop, and the sound of moving from the 1 to the 4, or from the 5 to the 6 minor, will become familiar to you in a relative sense. When you encounter a 1 to 4 movement in an unfamiliar key, you will be able to hear what it is without having to work it out. And as mentioned, whenever you are trying to understand a piece of music, keep in mind that the rules are broken all the time. They are only hints, so the music may do things that your theory does not predict or understand. Never let theory become a constraint on your expression. In part 3, we'll talk briefly about rhythm. I hope this video was useful to you. These videos do take weeks to produce, so if you have like 50 cents or $1 or $1,000 or $1,000,000, there's a link down there in the hoop-de-hoo for donations. Thanks.